We last left off with the introduction of Cloak and Dagger and their first appearance in the Marvel Universe as they start their vendetta against the criminals that sell drugs, while Spider-Man just seems to be along for the ride. These characters were red hot, so in October 1983, they got their own limited series. Bill Mantlo is still handling the writing of the characters, but now we have Rick Leonardi on pencils and Terry Austin on inks. We begin at 5 a.m. in the New York Port Authority, where the lowlives of the era, mainly hookers, gangbangers, and junkies, oh my, are hassling a priest before a cop tells the priest to leave because they're not worth it. He goes back to his church and begins to pray. He truly wants to help these people, but just doesn't know how. And so, like anyone who prays to God for help, a nubile teen girl appears on his altar. Oh, and Cloak is there too. No, of course they weren't sent by God. They came seeking sanctuary. And then we get the origin that we know of. Of course, the priest has no real response when they get to the "we kill people" part of their tale. But then we hop to the 21st precinct, and in the slammer are some junkies that were taken out by C&D, having been arrested. This is where Detective Bridget O'Reilly, because of course she's Irish, is on the case of these new vigilantes in her district. Of course, I like this other side of things when it comes to focusing on the cop on the trail of Cloak and Dagger, because frankly, it adds another positive perspective on who C&D are, since with Spider-Man it was justice, and with Bridget here, it's the law. Anyways, we hop back over to the plot, which is over at the church, where the priest, yeah, we learn that his name is Francis in a second, is giving them food and shelter. While he does help them though, he's not happy because they cannot be good people and do the sorts of things that they keep doing. But since he is a priest, he won't tell the police about them there. Yet Dagger doesn't realize why the cops would be after them. Father Francis gives them the obvious answer, that they're working outside of the law, but Cloak and Dagger then leave. I do like the touch that Cloak actually shows some form of decency by telling the priest to use his prayers to turn evil men good. Now I want to say that it's a real decent reaction to try and say that Father Francis is doing a good thing by trying to get these people to repent. But we all know that when dialogue ends with an ellipses at the end of a page, it means he gets to go with a "and we'll be continuing our vendetta in the meantime" in the next page. That solidifies Cloak as kind of a dick. Does it get better? Well, we hop over to a bus station, with two white-as-dabbing runaways coming to the big city. And you know what happens to rubes in the big city, right? Well, maybe the cast of Warriors Off-Broadway revival can teach them. I think the irony may be that if they were off-Broadway versions of the book characters, being rapists wouldn't be surprising. However, on the plus side, they didn't actually lie, and there does seem to be a farm-fresh bucket of KFC before them. But this is still a hero's book, so before Blondie actually gets assaulted, our yin-yang duo comes and saves the day. But this time, when the scumbags fire on them, Detective O'Reilly is actually right outside the slum apartment to hear the gunfires and rush in. Yet in the crossfire, as the two kids were fleeing, Jerry, the scrawny Smeagol-looking boy, is shot. Then Dagger lets her daggers fly, all the while the detective cradles the dying boy. That dramatic scene is kind of followed with Cloak saying that her light powers basically gets him off, which really makes her not technically a massacring of the lowlives a smidge more awkward. What's even more awkward is that that's when Detective O'Reilly calls them out on being responsible for the boy's death, with Tandy breaking down, only now just realizing that he was in fact shot in the crossfire. However, again, Cloak dons his douchey glasses to say that the stray bullet wouldn't have killed them because they're survivors. I also don't think that Detective O'Reilly really could have saved both the kids considering the amount of perps, or the fact she didn't know where they were until the bullets started flying. But semantics that I'll get into in a little bit, and Cloak and Dagger teleport away. The epilogue to this issue is just really the best capper to see where these characters are heading. Cloak and Dagger teleport back to the church, with Tandy truly questioning what monsters they've become. All the while, Father Francis gets a call to perform the last rites on a dead runaway. This epilogue just always gets to me, and honestly, I think it's more powerful a moment than any speechifying that has come beforehand or will come later. And the fun part is that even moments like this, we still haven't actually learned Cloak and Dagger's real name, even if I keep using them. But onward to issue 2, as we begin with a prologue. A man swaps out an aspirin bottle with a tainted bottle laced with poison, for no other reason than the fun of it. The story proper, however, begins with Cloak alone in an alleyway, starving for light and life. I also love that the newspaper in the alley ties to the prologue without taking away from the narration or being a distraction. As Cloak stumbles through the dark alleys of New York, he comes across a hooker and her pimp, the pimp beating her and dangling drugs to get her to work. Being as hangry as he is, Cloak pulls the pimp into the darkness of his cloak to basically eat him. Yet the hooker he saved needs her pimp because he may be a total parasite, but he does protect and feed her. This actually gets Cloak to spit out Mr. Pimp, and she cradles him. It's a moment like that which really points to the hard edge of Cloak and Dagger as characters. It's a grim clarity that shows an abused person defending their abuser because of rationalization, and it makes it even more sobering that she's not wrong in what he provides her. So the question becomes, how do you help someone who doesn't want to leave their comfort zone? Or rather, it would be a really interesting question if Dagger didn't show up, zap the hooker so now she's clean and walks hopefully into her new life. I'm not really going to rag on the makes it easy sort of thing, because it's a perfect way to show the difference between Cloak and Dagger. She can truly heal people with her light, while all Cloak can really do is hurt people with his darkness. And yeah, I think this, and something I'll mention later, is really what this scene is supposed to be all about. Moving on from that over-analysis, Cloak and Dagger goes back to the church, with Cloak finally feeling better because he fed off Dagger's light. But something is going on in the chapel of the church. Organ music draws Tandy to look. It is the funeral for the woman killed at the beginning of the issue, and in the shadows, Detective O'Reilly decides to light up in a freaking church. Only one man can light up in a church, and that's Michael Sheen, damn it. West Wing, a great reference for the kids to get, huh? When everyone leaves, Cloak and Dagger poofs in. The priest basically just catches them up on how the woman died, and here comes almost a heartbreaking scene given all that Dagger's been through over the last several issues. Because the woman died by drugs, Tandy tries to cleanse and basically resurrect her. She tries and sadly fails. The darkness was just too great for her. A friend of mine who got into comics thanks to more recent Marvel actually argued that this scene was dumb because why would Dagger think she could raise the dead? And I can kind of understand how some people can read it that way, but to me, and probably most of the audience, the scene is here not because she thought she was bigger than Jesus, but because she's human. She has been through so much in not just the last two issues, but since Mantlo created the character, she has always been perpetually on edge of being crippled by her compassion. So this was reaching that absolute need to help and save souls. And you also can't neglect her own guilt over the loss of the runaway boy last issue. However, there is still a murderer on the loose, and he will strike again. So Cloak and Dagger actually go directly to Detective O'Reilly's office at the precinct. She answers the only way an Irish lady cop knows how to, emptying every round of her revolver into Cloak's cloak. Please note that this is a joke about Irish women and their tempers, and not about the other thing that this joke could easily be misinterpreted as. But Cloak and Dagger are there to offer their help, with O'Reilly retorting with, "Your methods got a kid killed, I could have saved them both with the law." And I'll go into a minor rant here that I said I would. She couldn't. The problem using that argument here is that if Cloak and Dagger didn't show up, there wouldn't have been gunfire to alert her, and the runaways would have been assaulted on all fronts without a red hair on O'Reilly's head ever knowing that it had happened. But at the same time, without really knowing it, the detective isn't wrong. Before the gunfire even started, Cloak told Dagger to jerk their digglers fast, but she gave them the chance to surrender. It really is why I think Dagger gets more focused in these early stories, because of how innocent she is compared to Cloak. Either way, O'Reilly eventually agrees that they can help. And after seeing a map, it's literally a quick poof and Cloak and Dagger are there to stop the mad killer from poisoning children's aspirin this time. And Dagger is righteously pissed at this dirtbag, so she lets loose a bit of rage. Eventually O'Reilly comes in and we get the standard, "This isn't how you handle it, let me take him in." But the point is that Dagger is the one staring down O'Reilly's barrel on the side of an eye for an eye, letting her compassion for the children that could have died lead her into this act of retribution. Cloak, facing Dwayne the poisoner, begins to absorb him into his darkness, but O'Reilly shoves past Dagger to try and save the scum. It truly takes all of Cloak's willpower to not absorb the detective as well. O'Reilly demands Dwayne back, but Cloak is not sure that he could bring him back. Here's a good time to point to the fact that while Dagger has been open with her emotions, having cried several times in just the last two issues, it is easy to miss that Cloak has been battling more introverted problems. The darkness that he keeps under his cloak is truly eating at him, so he can't allow himself to have outbursts, and he has to internalize everything, which is why he's so resolute and downright cold at times. But it's time for issue 3, which begins with Dagger now in an alleyway looking for Cloak, who fled from her after the last issue. He's exiled himself to the sewers and refuses to eat Dagger's light. Yeah, I realize the phrasing of that, but their relationship has always had that sexual subtext, so I guess it's not that far of a leap. Either way, the justice-retribution argument comes to a head between the two. And I really kind of wish that Mantlo didn't use the exact "we aren't judge, jury, and executioner" line that O'Reilly used, because Dagger does understand their mission, and it's her compassion and goodness that's making her waver on the murder thing. So having her go, "but why?" is just a way to hammer the point in more for the message than the character, which does work for the tale. Of course, this is not helping CLOAK, who is finally given into the hunger to absorb people, even though Dagger's literally begging that she has enough light for both of them. Leaving the sewers, we then come to O'Reilly at the church, interrupting the Padre's prayers, mainly to lament about Cloak and Dagger, even going so far to show off her new silver bullets, cause like hell if she has any better idea on how to stop Cloak if he continues absorbing people. As the detective leaves, she says probably the most human line I've ever read when it comes to vigilante storylines. "That madman deserved whatever Cloak did to him. I was glad he got what he deserved. But that's why the law exists, Father, to make sure that one objective notion of justice supersedes our individual ideas of retribution." This is definitely a hot topic considering the state of the US justice system right now, but it's the spirit of what she's saying that really strikes home with me. We have a rule of law because there should be a line in the sand for what is air quote good and bad. Without that line, with people letting their emotions lead rather than logic or thought, someone who got their backpack stolen would be in the right to beat the thief to death, because that is how they feel at the time. It is retribution rather than lawfulness. And there's not a problem if we go more in depth on this topic in the comments below, though please remember it is a discussion and a debate, not a name-calling contest. After O'Reilly leaves the church though, Dagger stumbles from the darkness, severely weakened. I'll skip a really harsh joke about Tandy waking up naked in a priest's bed, so we can focus on the fact that while Cloak is refusing to feed off her light, she's still trying to send her energy out towards him. But she's been using too much, almost draining herself to nothingness. The priest tries to call Cloak a monster, but Dagger defends him, saying that it isn't Cloak that's the monster, it's just that he's darkness as much as she's light. Since I'm trying to really go into this analytically, here's the perfect time to bring up the hooker from the last issue, where Dagger is justifying Cloak's actions because she feels connected to Cloak, not wanting to admit that he's letting that darkness in more and more, though she is technically the pimp in this scenario, giving Cloak the fix of her light. And yet another brilliant parallel in the relationship between Tandy and Tyrone is that of being in a relationship with someone suffering from a mental illness like depression. Being the positive person in the relationship, Dagger gives and gives, doing all she can to help her friend, even giving her energy from far away. But there is a limit to how much someone can give in a relationship before their well runs dry. And that is where she is. Her reserves are empty, so she passes out. Meanwhile, Cloak is wandering the sewers, coming across a group of not Morlocks, just fugly homeless people and their precious fire. And like a biting rapper, Cloak steals their fire. They attack him since they're now in pitch-black sewers with no heat or light. While being mauled, Dagger's final lights hit Cloak, making him spit the bum's fire and realizing that he must leave the darkness. Or to continue my comparison from earlier, it's the moment of clarity after the hit that clears your mind of the withdrawal chaos. Back at the church, Father Francis takes Dagger to the hospital, but O'Reilly sneaks in with her silver bullets to wait for Cloak. While she hides in the confessional, the local scumbag gang decides to come in and loot the church. That's when Cloak steps from the shadows. Yet Dagger's word echoes in his ears, so he decides to do something we've actually never seen him do yet. He actually physically kicks their butt. Or rather, he would have if he didn't get distracted by thinking of Dagger after a flash of lightning, so he gets conked on the head with a cross. And yeah, this is a heavy hit, since he even gets kicked out of his cloak, so we can finally see a good look at him, and yeah, I think now's the time to really just bring up that while they're supposedly 16, Cloak and Dagger have never looked like teens, and Samuel Jackson's skeleton here is a good example of that. O'Reilly finally springs from the confessional to give the "you're under arrest," which always goes great in media, right? But Cloak recovers to be able to save the detective without having killed or cloaked any of the gangsters. Cloak even regurgitates the mad poisoner from last issue because he realizes that to be a man, he needs to deny the darkness and he must find Dagger. Dagger is at the hospital, her glow fading fast to end this issue. The final issue of this limited series is a doozy. CLOAK arrives at the hospital, but Father Francis tries to defend Dagger from him, thinking that CLOAK is a monster. But Detective O'Reilly can only stand there, hoping for the best. CLOAK apologizes to Dagger and returns a light she'd given him. They're both back to their perfect balance, and Dagger can only show her friend, her other half, the compassion that I've yacked on about. Yes, there is an argument to be made that this is still an unhealthy relationship, but if we go with the mental illness angle, him giving back her light would be him showing that he does care and is trying to overcome his illness, to at least give her that hope that they can make it work. But enough allegorical analysis, as now CLOAK and Dagger reveal their full backstory to Father Francis and Detective O'Reilly. Oh, first we get an understanding of Dagger's end of the deal with CLOAK. She has too much light, so CLOAK actually cools her from burning too bright, as it were. Now for the backstory. Yeah, I think that this is issue 9 of their overall appearances, and we finally learn Dagger's real name is Tandy Bowen, and she's a rich white girl from Cleveland. Yet she could never get the love of her mother, who I think is a porn star just cause that dude seems to be holding a prop camera, and there's no actual setup in the shot with her. But either way, mommy doesn't love her enough to stop working to go see her play the lead in Swan Lake. Yeah, she is a very good dancer and everyone knows it. Even when she's about to have a breakdown due to her mother being a bit of a bitch, she dances her heart out. She gets a ride home from, well, the comic says his name's Rob, but I'm going to call him Chad Von Brodu III, because you can honestly smell the Axe body spray wafting from the page as he tries to get into Tandy's leotard. Tandy then acts like the average teen girl to her stepfather, who's only trying to be supportive, but Tandy's overly emotional. And because she's a distraught teen girl, of course she gives in to Chad Von Brodu III, and 3 weeks later, he leaves to go to college without a second thought, then she runs away. It's time for CLOAK's backstory while his face melts. Geez, this artwork is moody, but sometimes it may be too heavy with the line work. So CLOAK's real name is Tyrone Johnson, though I've been using their real name since the very first video, so sorry if you didn't know that until now. And he's shooting some b-ball outside of the school, while his teacher and his parents talk about how he's doing good in school despite his impairment. I kinda hate that it's called an impairment, but yeah, Tyrone has a hell of a stuttering problem that does hurt his social interaction, and later on, could hurt his life. But he is a damn good ball player and does have a supportive friend in young Billy here. And since we're in tragic backstory land, later on, Billy and Ty are window shopping when some gangsters are actively robbing the place to grab a pair of ball of shoes too, and they shoot the store owner, who stumbles out into the street, falling into Billy's arms. The cops come up, but Billy, covered in this dude's blood, starts to run, terrified, not sure of what to do. Ty tries to tell the police officer that Billy wasn't involved, but the words won't come out due to his stutter, so the cop fires. Ty gets to Billy to hold his hand as Billy dies, and then Ty runs away. I can get into how high crime areas do have a higher mortality rate for both police officers and minorities. Or I can get into how this cop saw a black kid running away from a murder covered in blood. So there's at least some sense to why he would pull the trigger, but I'm not going to open up that can of worms. There is a lot of baggage to unpack just on this scene alone, which many people have their opinion on. And the saddest part of that is that both sides, outside of some extremist views, has understandable justification for their train of thought. That isn't to say that I agree with those trains of thought, I just say there is some justification to why people can think their certain way. But let's press on before we get bogged down in a hot topic that is uncomfortably above my pay grade. Though if you'd like to donate to my Patreon or directly to my PayPal for a review of a comic to really have that discussion on, like Black, then hey, links are in the description for all that good stuff. Shameless plug aside, Tandy and Tyrone are now in New York City, with nowhere to go but the streets. Interestingly, they actually meet because Tyrone was about to steal her purse, but someone else beat him to it. In return for saving her purse, Tandy takes Ty out to dinner, but afterwards, in a not quite ironic, but not exactly juxtaposing with the two runaways at the start of this miniseries, Ty and Tandy go with a group of gangsters for a, and I use air quotes, place to stay. And here is where we reach their backstory from their spectacular Spider-Man appearances as they're taken to Ellis Island where they're given experimental recreational drugs. While the other kids die, Tandy and Tyrone were able to escape into the night. Well, and the upper New York Bay. Well, see, there's your answer. They weren't actually given powers from the experimental drugs. It was swimming in New York Bay that altered their DNA like that. Okay, that joke may not be funny to anyone outside of New York State and maybe Jersey. But they do reach the city proper, and with Tandy glowing, Ty begins to dissolve into the shadows around him. Before before he grabs half an acre of cloth to wrap himself in. That's when, of all karmic coincidences, the same people that gave Ty and Tandy 2 Dr. Drugs comes across them again, only this time Ty and Tandy have their powers, so this was their first retribution as Cloak and Dagger. Hearing all this, Detective O'Reilly basically goes, "Oh well, in that case, go and do your retribution. Just stop killing people." The father, on the other hand, could only pray, and that is the end of their first limited series. This miniseries would be what really cements the mythos for Cloak and Dagger going forward, since now Cloak and Dagger are not just mysterious third-party guest stars, but we're able to have their arc to give them the more heroic stance and a solid groundwork. I've actually gotten into discussions before about how this miniseries kind of felt nothing like their characters from Spider-Man, but I think it's not so much about them being different, as Tandy was questioning their methods before this, but rather you can finally see Bill Mantlo had the characters truly fleshed out in his mind. Like I said in part 1, he thought of these characters in relation to Ellis Island, with Ellis Island bringing hope to people entering a new world, while these two characters were a bastardization of that, being that the modern version of this world is dark and grungy. But here, they are finding their place in that world and finally fleshed to the point where there's a clear mission statement going forward outside of drugs are bad, okay? However, that is all for part 2 of the reader's history of Cloak and Dagger. Next week we'll be heading back to Spider-Man for their next appearances, as well as the New Mutants. So be sure to click the subscribe button, hit the bell, and let me know what you think about the miniseries of these characters, or any of the topics that I brought up, in the comments below. While you're down there, if you're interested in suggesting some other characters, teams, or huge events for reader's history, let me know. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and please consider supporting our Patreon so I can get out of using Windows Movie Maker. But even just that thumbs up and sharing helps the channel in a big way. We do have a ways to go before we reach the 1K remonetization goal. But more than that, I'm the Comic Archivist, and stay golden, Inklings!